At the witness table were representatives from the Defense Contract Audit Agency and the Department of Defense.
Senator Stevens is going to be here. We understand, we hope that 2 or 3 more senators will come. In view of time and in fact that I have to catch a plane later on today, I will go ahead and convene the hearing. I have a terrible cold and I have a pocket full of Kleenex here, so I'll try to do my best to carry on. I would open the hearing today by first thanking and welcoming our witnesses that we have this morning. This subcommittee is looking at an investigation performed by the Defense Contract Audit Agency, or DCAA, into the improper and possibly illegal use of private consultants by large defense prime contractors. Last summer, we held hearings that focused primarily on the use of private consultants who work directly for the Pentagon. We call these people direct hire consultants. At issue today are the activities of those consultants who are hired by defense contractors but charged to the Pentagon and ultimately whose costs are passed on to the taxpayer. Several such indirect hire consultants are under investigation at this time in connection with the massive FBI grand jury Pentagon probe code called, quote, ill wind, unquote. Although consultants certainly do perform legitimate functions, the ill wind probe suggests that consultants may also be involved in criminal activities involving bribery, fraud, collusive bidding, and trafficking in confidential material. After 6 months, the grand jury is still meeting on ill wind, and today's DCAA audit may give us a clue why it is taking so long. In fact, DCAA found that roughly 1/5 of all consultant costs charged to the government by 12 particular defense contractors were at best questionable and at the worst criminal. In other words, the government may be getting ripped off to the tune of maybe 18 cents on the dollar whenever the defense industry charges us for the use of a consultant. The audit team found that contractors have charged the taxpayers millions of dollars so they could lobby Congress on defense projects, lobby the Pentagon on weapons contracts, launch PR campaigns, defend themselves in government court cases, entertain and promote private international arms sales, all at public expense. Last summer, we were shocked by the lax controls and monitoring of direct hire consultants at the Pentagon. Today's study shows that the sister world of consultants on the payroll of military contractors, the story might be even worse. It also suggests that the much ballyhooed theory of this administration that defense contractors or consultants will police themselves without strict controls is, in my opinion, a pipe dream. Today we're going to get into specific cases of abuse and illegalities that are behind the DCAA report. These cases often involve reputable companies and former high-ranking U.S. and foreign government officials. However, the names will be admitted at the request of DCAA, and because the primary culprits here are the contractors who charge those consultant costs to the government. We're also going to find out this morning what efforts are being made by DOD to address the specific problems raised in the DCAA audit report, and what steps are being taken to ensure that tighter controls are imposed on the use and the monitoring of consultants. Let me give the highest praise to Mr. Reed and to his agency, DCAA. This is one of the finest and most helpful documents I have read from this office. Let me also compliment Dr. Costello's acquisition office for supporting this particular study. I hope that we can agree on some active measures to address these problems. There are other issues that relate to the particular one that we're looking at today. One, the revolving door issue. Foreign agents and sales and how those foreign agents are paid and by whom. The so-called buddy system that we see throughout the consulting world. Costs that are not legal, which are passed to the taxpayer. Possible conflicts of interest, those consultants that may be working for the private defense contractor and also for foreign governments and for the Department of Defense at the same time. And also, and finally, the Department of Defense management philosophy, which I hope to discuss this morning. We have two witnesses before us this morning. One, Mr. William H. Reed, the Director of the Defense Contract Audit Agency. He will be accompanied by Mr. Bernard Topf, the Regional Director, Defense Contract Audit Agency, the Western Region. Would Mr. Reed and Mr. Topf please come to the witness table? Once again, I applaud your report. I know that you looked at 12 defense contracting firms, and I think these are the 12 largest firms. I look forward to your statement this morning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I am pleased to appear before you and this subcommittee to discuss DCAA's role in the review of consultant costs charged to Department of Defense contracts. I previously appeared before this subcommittee on July 8th of this year to testify on DCAA's responsibilities, procedures, and the applicable regulations relating to the review of consultant costs charged to government contracts. Today, I will address DCAA's special audit of defense contractor consultant costs that resulted in our recent report dated October 24th, 1988. As you noted, appearing with me is Mr. Bernard Topf, DCAA's Western Regional Director, and he was the task force director of this special audit. As one of a number of actions taken by the Secretary of Defense in regard to the procurement investigation, DCAA was directed on July 25th, 1988, to form a task force to conduct an audit of contractor consulting costs. In making this request, Secretary Carlucci noted that recent disclosures of possible abuse by contractor consultants to improperly influence the acquisition process are of serious concern to the Department of Defense, that costs to exert such influence are clearly unallowable as charges to defense contracts, and that diligence must be exercised to assure that costs are not included in defense contracts and referrals for investigations of abuse are made where applicable. Specifically, the task force was asked to conduct an audit of a representative sample of large defense contractors to determine the nature and extent of consulting costs charged to defense contracts. The audit results will be furnished to the Undersecretary of Defense for acquisition, for forwarding to the Secretary, along with recommendations for any needed modifications to the regulations. A task force was formed consisting of Mr. Topf and 3 regional audit managers from DCAA's Eastern, Mid-Atlantic, and Central regions. The task force made the contract selections, defined the auditing plan, organized the supporting audit elements, and provided managerial direction throughout the review. The actual audit work at each contractor location was carried out by staff members of the Cognizant DCAA field office. In arriving at the selection of contractors for audit, we examined the top defense contractors to identify those who had submitted recent certified indirect cost submissions. Also, we considered the contractors' products and services, programs, and primary DoD procurement sources. Our objective was to select a representative sample which was not skewed towards a particular product, military service, or procurement activity. The 12 companies selected received 32% of prime defense contract awards in fiscal year 1987 and supply a wide variety of goods and services to the Army, Navy, and Air Force. They also rank in the top 25 defense contractors in terms of cost reimbursable and fixed price incentive contracts. Within the 12 selected companies, we chose for examination those segments with the most significant incurred costs on cost reimbursable and fixed price incentive contracts, their group headquarters, and if applicable, their corporate office. A detailed examination was made of those costs incurred in the latest year and for which a certified claim had been received when our review began in early August 1988. At the onset of our review, we encountered significant difficulty in isolating consulting services and costs due to the lack of a universally accepted definition of the term. The Federal Acquisition Regulation, the governing cost principle, addresses professional service costs together with consultant costs without distinguishing between the two. Further, contractors had no routine means of separately identifying nor accumulating these costs. Consequently, we determined that all costs covered by FAR 31205-33 should be examined in order to reduce the risk that a misunderstood definition would result in the exclusion of pertinent items. Investigatory methods are beyond the scope of auditing procedures and were not applied in this review. Therefore, we place principal reliance upon contractor-supplied documentation. Primarily, the agreement or the contract between the contractor and the entity performing the service, the work products, and the billing documents to determine the nature of the cost and whether the costs were allowable in accordance with FAR 31205-33. Absent some indication in that documentation or a clear inference from it, we had no means to ascertain whether the services involved the possible exertion of improper influence on the acquisition process. A copy of our entire report has been submitted to the subcommittee. Therefore, in the interest of time, I would just like to highlight the major conditions and recommendations. We found that contractors were spending considerable sums supplementing virtually every in-house activity with professional and consultant services. During the period reviewed, $237 million of such costs were charged either directly to defense contracts or included in indirect cost claims. Legal, engineering, and financial services accounted for $163.9 million, or approximately 69% of that total, while lobbying, sales, marketing, and management services accounted for $51.2 million, or 22%. The balance of the $237 million involved numerous other types of service, some of which could not be identified. Auditors concluded that $57.6 million of these costs were questionable under various federal acquisition regulation cost principles. Most of these questionable expenditures represent claim costs where the contractor could not produce evidence of services rendered, or to a lesser degree could not produce written agreements as to the value and type of service being purchased. In a number of cases, contractors stated they will ultimately be able to locate and produce adequate support for some of these costs. We believe contractors should have had such support readily available before including these costs in certified overhead claims. Approximately $43 million of the questionable cost were charged to DoD contracts of all types. Of this amount, $19 million would be reimbursed on DoD flexibly priced contracts if allowed. In addition to the questionable costs, we found examples of weaknesses in every significant internal control area related to professional fees and consultant costs. A list of the deficiencies include: 1, determination of needs, selection of source, determination of fee, monitoring of services were all performed by a single individual or organization. 2, absence of a written contract. 3, description of services to be performed were inadequate to ascertain the appropriate accounting treatment, to monitor the performance, or to determine the allowability, or identify whether the fee is a retainer or for specific services. 4, absence of documentation demonstrating that service was unavailable in-house or that such availability was considered. 5, absence of evidence of competition in selection of the firm. 6, absence of evidence that fees were reasonable in view of the services procured. 7, lack of an adequate accounting review to ascertain accuracy or accounting classification. 8, failure to adhere to existing company policies and procedures. 9, failure of internal audit to examine operations of internal controls in this area. As a result of these conditions, our report included the following recommended actions. FAR 31205-33 should be revised to strengthen unallowability criteria, clarify the documentation to support claim cost, and better define professional fees and consultant cost. Contracting officers responsible for settlement of final indirect cost rates should assure that $19 million of claim cost is disallowed unless additional support is submitted and reviewed by DCAA. Contracting officers and DCAA auditors at individual contractor locations need to aggressively pursue contractor correction of internal control weaknesses over the approval and control of consultant costs and cost estimating procedures used to propose such cost. Contracting officers should assure that contractors fulfill their responsibilities to delete unallowable costs from their claims to the government in accordance with FAR 31201-6, and to demonstrate to DCAA that such screening properly deleted directly associated costs as well as the unallowable costs themselves. Since forwarding of this report to the Undersecretary of Defense for acquisition, Actions have been taken or are in process on all of our recommendations. In addition, DCA plans to accelerate our consultant reviews at major cost centers of the next 18 largest contractors. Like the prior reviews, these audits will cover the most recent contractor fiscal year for which we have received a certified cost submission. Fieldwork at these new locations will be completed by 28 February 1989, with reports being issued within 60 days thereafter. Following these additional accelerated reviews, consultant costs will continue to be a high priority item when performing incurred cost audits at all contractors. Mr. Chairman and members of the subcommittee, that concludes my statement. Mr. Topf and I would be glad to respond to any questions you may have.
Mr. Reed, thank you very much. We're very pleased to have Senator Stevens of Alaska. And Senator Stevens, I will call on you now.
Thank you very much. I've long been wary of some of these overseas costs. Let me ask you one basic question. As I understand your statement, all of these costs are subject to review, and unless they can be justified, they will be charged back to the contractor. Is that right? None of these have been lost in terms of the recovery process, so to speak. Is that right?
That is not exactly correct. $19 million of the costs that have been questioned are charged to flexibly priced contracts, and those we have not lost. We have the opportunity to challenge those costs and to disallow them. Costs that go, however, that are charged to firm fixed price contracts, we have no mechanism to recover those costs. Our opportunity to eliminate such cost in firm fixed price contracts is when the contract price is being established and negotiated. In those contracts, we have no remedy at this point on these unallowable costs.
Well, on those, if the contractor exceeds the estimate, they're going to eat them anyway, right?
That is correct.
But as I understand it, some of them, you still have to have adequate data, don't you, to substantiate the costs?
Yes,
even
sir.
under the fixed contract?
Yes, sir, that is correct.
And on this, you've indicated that there's a series of these contracts in which there's no fixed data, not adequate data. So those couldn't be charged a contract even under fixed fee contract if they don't have documentation, can they?
Yes, they could be. The documentation requirement is when the price of the contract is being originally negotiated and set. At that time, the contractor is required to submit cost or pricing data to support what he is proposing as the cost of that contract. The government has an opportunity to review that data and negotiate the price. Once the price is set, there is no basis to adjust that price thereafter. What we need to focus on as a result of this review is whether or not we are getting adequate supporting data, cost and pricing data, when firm fixed price contracts are being negotiated. And that's the direction that I'm giving to my auditors, is we have to be more careful in reviewing cost or pricing data of firm fixed price contracts in the future to make sure these kinds of costs are properly supported.
I see. In other words, if you enter into a fixed price contract, one of the aspects would be the contractor wouldn't have to keep the details they'd have to have if they were not on a fixed price contract. Is that correct?
That's correct. Once we establish that $1 million is a fair and reasonable price, regardless of what makes up that $1 million, he's going to be paid $1 million for that service.
Well, I was concerned with the top line. 37 million of the 57 million is a lack of adequate agreement or work product. Now, how can you break that down between fixed price and non-fixed price contract?
The estimated amount that was charged to DOD contracts there of $43 million, approximately $19 million of that amount would go to flexibly priced contracts.
I see. Now, in terms of your review, is part of the work product of your review going to be recommendations to the Congress on how this process might be tightened up and we can avoid charging to the taxpayers items that should be absorbed by the contractor?
No, sir. My recommendations are directed to the department. The Secretary asked me to make recommendations to him as to ways that he could improve the regulations and controls within the department and our responsibilities to monitor these costs. And that's what I have recommended to him. I believe the actions that have been recommended will adequately address these problems and give us the tools we need as auditors to make sure that these costs either are not claimed or are eliminated where they are.
Well, I may want to review this fixed price contract again, so just one more question along that line, Mr. Chairman. As I understand you now, if a fixed price contract is entered into, it's not possible to later challenge the costs that were incurred and billed to the government, even though they may be costs that would be contrary to the regulations if entered into by a non-fixed price contractor. Is that correct?
That is correct. The only way that the cost could be challenged is under the defective pricing provisions if the contractor submitted inaccurate, non-current, or misleading information during the negotiation of the price. In these cases here, we did not go into that step, but that is a possible remedy when these contracts are reviewed for defective pricing. If the cost or pricing data was not complete and accurate in support of the proposed price, there may be a basis to assert defective pricing.
Well, I may have been in error, but I've got to tell you, in another subcommittee I worked, the Defense Appropriations Subcommittee, that was not my understanding. It was not my understanding that a fixed price contractor could still charge the government costs that were not, that were contrary to the regulations as far as lobbyist costs, sellers, unallowable seller's fee, foreign selling costs. I thought we had prohibited that. Now, if we failed somehow, I'm going to have the Defense Subcommittee review that, but I thought we tied that down, that unallowable costs are unallowable costs, and you cannot charge them to government, even if you've got a fixed price contract. If I haven't done that right, if we haven't done that right, we'll do it right. But I would ask you, at this point of the record, to review your comments and see if we've had a meeting of minds concerning my questions and your answers, because I don't quite understand it that way, and I want to make sure that you get a chance to review that record before we put another group of investigators to work on this.
I'd be happy to do that.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Bingaman of New Mexico.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me try to clarify my understanding of the situation. As you are describing it, the various of these costs that are listed here as questionable are not allowed in the case of negotiated contracts or cost-plus contracts, but are allowed in the case of fixed-price contracts, or could be allowed?
Well, the timing is the issue here. When you negotiate a firm fixed price contract, the contractor is going to assume the risk of performance at whatever cost. In other words, his reimbursement is not going to be based on his actual cost expended. It's going to be based on the price that we agreed to in advance.
Right.
So our opportunity to establish a fair and reasonable price, which excludes all of these kinds of unallowable activities, is when we negotiate the price of a firm fixed price contract. After we do that, and subsequently if we find out that he actually charged some unallowable cost to that contract, you could argue that that doesn't affect the fair and reasonable price that was set for that contract, because we looked at all the costs that he proposed and there were no unallowable costs in there. So the unallowable cost could be viewed as really being offset against an allowable cost that he didn't incur for some reason or against his profit.
Now, are the contracts that you audited to come up with these figures, were they firm fixed price contracts?
We audited charges, all the charges that were allocated were either directly charged or allocated to DOD contracts of all types, firm fixed price and flexibly priced. We did that because we wanted to answer the Secretary's question about what was the nature and extent of consulting services being charged to DOD contracts. He did not differentiate flexibly priced versus firm fixed price.
Now, on flexibly priced contracts, is it uniformly the case that the contracts the DOD enters into do not permit reimbursement for the kinds of costs that you have here for many of these? I mean, you've got sort of two things on this chart as I see it. You've got things that are questionable because there wasn't adequate evidence, or like, for example, the first item, lack of adequate agreement or work product, I guess what you're saying there is that you could not determine from your audit what the person did to justify the payment.
That is correct.
So that it may have been perfectly okay, it may not have been.
That is correct.
Further down, you've got legislative lobbying costs. Now, I think Senator Stevens' point is one that I'd sort of share. My thought is that as a general matter, we probably would not want consultants to defense contractors charging the defense contractors and ultimately the government for legislative lobbying costs. That doesn't seem like an appropriate thing to have those folks charge us regardless of what evidence they have or anything else. It's just as a category. You put that up as questionable. Why haven't you just put that up as unallowable? Why don't we have two charts here, one unallowable cost and one questionable cost?
In the audit report, there are different schedules differentiating the cost the way you're describing. There is a schedule of cost which apply only to the overhead costs claimed for allocation to flexibly priced contracts. This particular schedule includes costs that were charged to both firm fixed price and flexibly priced, and therefore we use the term questionable because of the distinction that we've been discussing regarding the nature of a firm fixed price contract versus a flexibly priced contract.
I guess what I'm still unsure about is, do we need to change the law, or does DOD need to change its contract provisions to ensure that some of these costs are not charged to the government under any circumstance?
I don't think we do. For example, if a contractor is proposing a price to us on a firm fixed price contract.
I know about firm fixed price,
Okay.
but I'm talking about flexibly priced now. On flexibly priced contracts, is there any justification or any reason why the government should want to pay for legislative lobbying costs?
Absolutely not. It's
Okay.
it's an explicitly unallowable cost.
It's explicitly unallowable in the existing law and regulations.
Yes, sir. That is correct.
So you list it as questionable, but in fact, anything that is identified as legislative lobbying costs is clearly not chargeable. It's unallowable.
That is correct. But the amount that's shown up there as legislative lobbying cost was included in indirect cost, which are then allocated to both flexibly priced and firm fixed price contracts. So it would have been misleading to label that as unallowable cost and at the amount stated on that chart.
Right.
In the sense of what we would say on a flexibly priced contract.
Okay, so you don't really think I mean, there are several that sort of fall into that category, I would think. I don't know, could you tell me what your understanding of the present law and regulations are with regard to funds expended in defense against government claims and appeals in that area? I mean, are those, as a general matter, in flexibly priced contracts, unallowable costs?
Yes, sir, that is correct. There is a specific cost principle in the acquisition regulations which states explicitly that costs of pursuing claims or defense of claims against the government are unallowable.
And the same with the prosecution of claims against the government?
That is correct.
And the same with defense of fraud proceedings?
That is correct.
So those are all items which, in the case of flexibly priced contracts, as long as, to the extent that we can determine that a contractor is charging those or has a consultant that's charging those to the contractor who in turn charges them to the government, they are in violation of the regulations.
They are in violation of the regulations, and these issues are picked up in DCA's audits and questioned.
Okay, and there's no need for a change in the regulations to make that clear?
That is correct.
Is there a need for a change in the regulations to make anything else clear?
Yes, the first area, the lack of adequate agreement or work product, came about, I believe, because the current cost principle states that contractors must furnish sufficient evidence of the nature and extent of services received from consultants. Many contractors apparently interpreted that to exclude work product evidence, and were thinking that, in other words, they felt the test of meeting that was much less than we viewed it. We felt that in order to determine the nature and extent of services rendered, you really needed to see a written agreement as to what services were being purchased, and you needed to see the product that was provided for those as a result of those payments in some form, be it memorandum, a report, a letter, some documentation that someone actually did something for the money that was received. Consequently, our first recommendation is that particular cost principle be expanded to explicitly state that the evidence of nature and services rendered must include or will include, and it lists the type of documentation that we think was absent in these situations.
And Ms. Spector is proposing a change in the regulation to meet that recommendation.
Yes, she is.
Yes. Okay. That's all I have right now, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Senator Bingaman. We've discussed regulations this morning to some extent, and I would just like to say, on behalf of myself, I'm not proposing we add a lot of new regulations. Here are the regulations right now, the federal acquisition regulations. I think about 50% of this, Senator Stevens and Senator Bingaman, apply to the Department of Defense, if I'm not mistaken. So we're not really seeking to add a lot of new paperwork or regulations. But we do know that we have a major problem here. The first question I'd like to ask is, it's not a prepared question, but this audit that you've just completed was mandated by Secretary Carlucci in July of '88. Is this correct?
That is correct.
And before that time, when was the last audit done that looked specifically at consulting and consulting costs?
We audit these costs on a routine basis every year. What we have never done before is do it on a national basis all at one time and collect all the results from all the different locations in one collective summary type report. Ordinarily, the audit office at each particular contractor would perform a review of their overhead expenses and their direct costs, including consultant costs, every year, and submit a report to the contracting officer at that location, who would then negotiate the allowable final rates on contracts for that particular year. Would then negotiate the allowable final rates on contracts for that particular year.
In the past, how many dollars have you recovered for the United States government, for the taxpayer, in those previous audits?
I would have to provide that for the record,
Not
Senator.
many, though. Correct? Not many dollars from the consulting.
No, sir. I would conclude it has been substantial.
All right. So you're looking at 12 contractors, and they get about 30% of most of the defense work. And you have found some $43 million in questionable costs that they were trying to pass on to the taxpayers. Is that a conclusion that we can reach here?
Yes.
Right. Now, this was the first time you've done such a massive audit, I assume. You've just stated that. What sort of reception, what sort of cooperation did you get out there in the field when you went to these major defense firms?
I think I'll let Mr. Topf answer that one,
Mr.
since
Topf,
he
you
dealt with
try to
that on a
answer that.
day-to-day basis.
You probably were out there in the field, and what, you walked in the door, what'd they say?
Well, I would say that the response was different at different contractors and different at different segments of contractors. You know, many of these contractors have pretty decentralized control. Some have centralized control. So there's a lot of stories out there. I would say at best, the contractors, given the impetus of the Secretary's request, were cooperative to the extent of working with us, trying to identify the universe. Keep in mind, the first problem we had was the identification of the universe of consultant and professional services costs, because contractors do not have an account that says consultant, and that's it, and every consultant gets charged to it. Consultants are charged throughout a series of accounts. Professional services are charged throughout a series of accounts, and as Mr. Reed explained, there is no differentiation in the FAR, so we had to look at both. So some contractors were very cooperative in trying to identify that universe. Others pretty well stonewalled us and did not attempt to identify.
Let me ask you if I can just recite from page 1, report of the audit DCAA, and let me ask you if you agree with this quote. This is your report. Widespread contractor resistance was encountered to DCAA access to information on unclaimed costs needed to determine that contractors had screened out related directly associated costs as required by
Right.
FAR. I mean,
I was going to get to that, Senator.
why did they resist?
I may as well cover that now.
Why did they resist?
They resisted because what you're looking at up there, that schedule, is the schedule of questionable costs related to claim costs. There's also a schedule in the audit report, a fairly large amount of money, of unclaimed costs. And in those unclaimed costs might be anything. We know there is significant amounts of consultant costs that have not been claimed by contractors, aside from the connotations of Operation Illwind, where many of the people that have been mentioned in the media were in unclaimed costs as well as in claim costs. We also have a responsibility to determine whether or not a consultant who is not claimed and therefore not charged to government contracts may well have incurred costs which the contractor has claimed. He may have, it may say $25,000 a month plus expenses, and the expenses could be a secretary provided or support services provided by the contractor, and these particular costs could be in allowable counts. So we feel very strongly that we do need access to unclaimed costs. Contractors, I think we encapsulated it pretty clearly in the report.
Now, Mr. Topf and Mr. Reed, both of you are American taxpayers, and by April 15th, we assume you send in your tax returns. When you take a deduction, exemption, whatever, you have the burden of proof of furnishing the facts to justify that deduction or that exemption. Does the contractor have that same burden of proof to justify the costs that are being passed on to the taxpayer in this process? Is that same burden there?
It certainly is, and as we noted in the audit report, we were surprised that the lack of adequate agreement and work product support for a large amount of these costs.
All right, now the taxpayer may go to jail, or he may get a big penalty of 30 or 40% of the debt, or maybe 120% of the debt if they can't justify it. What happens to the contractor? What punitive damages, what penalties, is there interest collected on that debt ultimately if it is collected? Describe that to us.
Well, as of contracts awarded after March of 1987, there is a new clause which does apply penalties with interest on unallowable costs of this nature that are claimed on our contracts. These audits here would primarily be affected by contracts which were issued prior to that. So in the future, we do have a new mechanism, a regulation in place which goes into new contracts after March of '87, which will assert penalties with interest for claiming unallowable costs.
All right. Now, out in the field, when you looked at these 12 defense contractors, and I assume you were in many of their field offices across the United States, and their plants, et cetera, and corporate offices, have you found that any of the consultants hired by the contractor to perform a service were also hired at the same time or doing work simultaneously, one for the Department of Defense? Were they working both sides of the street?
I'll answer, and let Mr. Topf maybe add if he would. I don't believe we had the capability to determine that from the audit evidence that we looked at.
In all of these rules and regulations about acquisition, doesn't the conflict of interest just jump out at you on this? I mean, this is pretty incredible to me.
Well, we are certainly aware of the current concern over conflicts of interest and the considerations that are being given to such things as registration and certification.
All right, what about, did you in your work, and once again, I applaud your work, in your study or report that you submitted, did you find any of these consultants hired by the defense contractors also working for, at the same time, simultaneously, foreign governments? Did you uncover any of that?
Once again, I would have to say no, we did not, because we would have no capability of cross-checking something like that.
Third question, do you have any way of cross-checking in all of your searching of these thousands of documents in 12 companies, defense contractors? Did they hire consultants who worked, well, let's see, did they have any consultants on board who were convicted felons? There's no way to determine that, is there?
There is no way.
Because there's no cross-check.
Not in the kind of procedures that an auditor follows. You
Right.
cannot determine that
And there's no
kind of
registration.
information. That is correct.
So there's no way to know who these people are working for.
That is correct.
Now, we looked at 12 contractors, $200 and some odd million in $250 million basically, just with 12. How many consulting dollars are out there among the other 60 or 70%, let's say, of the defense contractors? How many consulting dollars out there?
It's I cannot give you an exact answer, but I make some observations. First of all, in addition to the $200 and some million that we identified here, there was another $130 million at these 12 locations, which was voluntarily deleted. So even at,
What do you mean voluntarily deleted?
These are consultant costs that the contractor incurred himself, but chose not to claim against his government contracts.
I see.
A second observation would be these are among the 12 largest defense contractors in the country.
Right.
And they represent some 32% of the prime contract awards. I don't think you could just multiply it by, say, a factor of 3. But certainly I think the amount is got to be considered in the billions.
Now, Mr. Reed, you're a fine public servant. You have absolutely impeccable credentials. Now, didn't you go home at night after this report was finished and say, you know, this problem is bigger than we think? Do you ever have feelings like that?
I have feelings like that all the time. And that's what my job's all about, is finding problems and...
Is this the tip of the iceberg?
That we certainly think it is, and that's the reason we are immediately expanding this review to 18 more of the larger contractors, and we are going to be hitting consultant costs in our audits very hard in the future, believe me.
I'm going to yield to Senator Stevens.
No, I have no more questions.
Senator Bingaman.
Just to try to clarify some confusion here, on firm fixed price contracts, why are people keeping track of what their costs are so that you can audit it? I mean, or what is the relevance? I mean, if I have a firm fixed price contract, if the government has signed a contract with for $1 million and hired me to do something for $1 million, I guess it's important to, after the fact, to know whether the government made a bad deal. I mean, if 50% of that $1 million turns out to be profit, and they really should have entered into a cheaper contract, I guess that would be useful. But except for that, sort of looking to see whether you made a bad deal after the fact, what is the relevance? I mean, why are you auditing the costs that people incur in performing on fixed price contracts? I just don't see. There's no prohibition. You can incur any costs you want, or fail to incur any costs, or take 75% of it home in profit, or do anything you want if it's a firm fixed price contract, can't you?
We have to remember that we are looking at both direct and indirect cost in our audits. Indirect costs, of course, are allocated across a base of all work: commercial, firm fixed price incentive, and cost type. Therefore, a transaction in the overhead is tested for allowability, and once allowability or unallowability is established, then the impact to the various types of contracts making up the base is determined. Likewise, if we're looking at direct cost, we audit a contractor's system for recording his costs, and we want to know whether his costs are being recorded consistently. In other words, if he charges legal fees direct to a government contract, does he charge similar legal fees direct to his commercial work and his firm fixed price contract, or does he charge it into overhead? In order to make those kinds of determinations about consistency and allocability, you have to look at all the cost. Now, in addition, the contractor is required to comply with the Truth in Negotiations Act, with defective pricing, which gives us the authority to go back in and examine his actual cost incurred on firm fixed price contracts in order to determine whether the cost and pricing data he submitted as a basis for negotiating that price was current, accurate, and complete.
Okay. You also testified that that since, I guess, the middle of last year, penalties with interest are chargeable on unallowable costs that contractors incur. In your view, is that provision that imposes penalties with interest, is that adequate to dissuade or deter the practice of charging unallowable costs, or is something more needed?
By itself, it's probably not, but we have a number of things that are going on. First of all, we have overhead certification, which we held high hopes for, and which has helped. Did not help in these cases, obviously, because some still got through. We also have considerable effort by the defense industry to clean up their act. It's important to note that these are 86, 87 costs that we're looking at here before a lot of the current self-governance initiatives were started by companies, and companies themselves, quite frankly, in the claims that they are preparing today, are doing a much better job of screening out the unallowable cost than they did back in these prior years. But that's not to say that they shouldn't have done a better job in these years as well, because they did sign a certificate that to the best of their knowledge and belief, they were not claiming any unallowable costs.
Now, how does that certificate that they signed, saying that to the best of their knowledge and belief they were not claiming unallowable costs, how does that differ from the overhead certification that you say is going to improve matters?
That is what I'm talking about. They did make the overhead certification.
And what's the sanction, or what's the penalty for certifying something that turns out not to be the case?
Well, if we have information which leads us to believe that the statement is false, then that is subject to investigation for perjury.
But you would have to demonstrate not just that the costs were in fact unallowable, but that they intentionally charged costs that they knew were unallowable.
That they had knowledge or should have had there was a reasonable basis to conclude they had knowledge or should have had knowledge.
That's a pretty tough burden of proof on you or on the government to demonstrate that someone not only charged costs that they shouldn't have charged, but that they intentionally did it knowing it was wrong.
That is a tough burden.
Yeah, so the only concrete penalty that has been added or the only concrete disincentive that has been added is this penalty with interest that can be charged on unallowable costs, regardless of whether they were put in with good faith or not. I mean, what you're saying now is that under the new regulations, you can go ahead and charge penalties and charge interest, or the government can. Department of Defense can charge penalties and charge interest on unallowable costs, regardless of whether the company thought they were doing the right thing or didn't think they were doing the right thing or anything else.
One point of clarification on that, the penalties apply to unallowable costs which are explicitly unallowable. In other words, the penalties would not reach to areas of disagreement. For example, the auditor may say, we believe this is legislative lobbying. The contractor may argue, no, this was not lobbying. This was providing requested information, which would be, in other words, these issues are not always crystal clear as to whether they meet the test of allowability or not, and they're subject to negotiation. In those instances, the penalty would probably not be asserted. So there's another judgment involved that the contracting officer would have to make to assert the penalty. In other words, was the cost explicitly unallowable to the extent that the contractor should not have claimed it? If there's a reasonable doubt as to whether the cost is allowable or unallowable, the penalty would probably not be asserted.
So it's really within the discretion of the Department of Defense to decide whether they think it's so clearly unallowable they should impose a penalty.
That's correct.
Or whether it's so questionable that they should not impose a penalty.
That's correct. And that, I believe that's a fair way of applying it, because many of these issues are not crystal clear as to the nature of the cost.
Let me just ask once more and then I'll quit here, but is there something more that you think needs to be put into the law or the regulations to discourage the charging of unallowable costs in addition to this penalty and interest provision?
I don't believe so at this time. The penalties and interest provisions are really just going to start becoming effective in the future, near future, and it remains to be seen how effective that will be. And I think we need to see that first. Also, as I say, I'm very encouraged by what I'm seeing the defense industry doing today versus what they did back in 1987 to screen these costs better. Believe me, they have gotten the message that we are not going to stand for the same kind of practices that have gone on in the past.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Bingaman. Mr. Reed, we were furnished, and of course we will not, because of the grand jury investigation, reveal the names of the consultants nor the consultant firms, but we were furnished a list of some of those firms, I think 10, and the types of fees that they charged ultimately passed on or were attempting to pass on to the taxpayer. One of these firms is I'm quoting, vouchers listed items such as golf fees and entertainment expenses. The consultant agreement was not clear as to the types of services that were provided, etc. Then we have one I find of great interest, and I imagine this could be probably multiplied several times, vouchers in support of the expenses identified, entertainment and lobbying for purposes of, quote, enhancing contractor's image with the Department of Defense. And that was passed on to the poor old taxpayer. Now, we have looked at these 10 firms and 10 individuals, and we only find 4 of the 10, our staff, who are actually registered as lobbyists. Doesn't that strike you as a little bit interesting?
It doesn't surprise me one bit. I think, in our audits have uncovered quite a bit of activity that we consider to be lobbying, which is being done by non-registered lobbyists. And just the fact, if you look at how many registered lobbyists there are in these major companies as compared to the size of their Washington offices, you immediately have to raise your eyebrows with a degree of skepticism.
I must say that, well, I won't say that now. I may later. How much self-policing do you see out there, Mr. Reed? One, in the private sector of the consultants and the private defense contractors. How much self-policing is out there?
There's a significant amount of activity currently going on throughout the defense industry.
Is this because of the ill wind investigation?
It's because of ill wind. It's because of some of the prior convictions that the department...
P-R-I-O-R? Or no.
Yes, IOR. Obviously, we've had some major settlements and convictions or pleas in this past year at very huge amounts, in the hundreds of millions of dollars, which have really, I think, opened up some eyes in the defense industry that they are taking a unacceptable risk in claiming some of these types of activities or doing some of the things they've been doing.
But up until now, there's been no risk. There's no penalty up until 1987. Is that correct?
Well, in the sense of regulatory adjustment, the self-policing, I think, is being more motivated by the criminal prosecutions of people who are stepping over that line. For example, the recent publicity which announced a $115 million settlement with a major defense contractor, and another one prior to that was in the $90 million range, settlement with a defense contractor. And these kinds of issues started from accounting issues and auditing issues that were developed by DCAA in these kinds of audits. But there was sufficient reason in those cases to call in the investigators and take it the next step. And that's what has industry concerned, and that's why they are really becoming much more aggressive in self-policing.
Does the Inspector General of DOD or the Office of Ethics or your office or the Acquisition Office, do you have an amnesty program for these people who come in and say, we have been bilking the poor old taxpayer, and we've been charging golf fees and entertainment and lobbying and whatever, and before we get caught, we want to confess and here's the money? Do you give them amnesty?
We certainly do not. There is a...
How many of them have come in?
There has been a significant number of voluntary disclosures. I believe the number is in the area of 130. Don't hold me to that exactly. Voluntary disclosures to the DOD IG. Now, these voluntary disclosures are not being treated as amnesty programs. Going after the money with vigor. The IG is insisting that there be penalties leveraged against the guilty parties, prosecutions in some cases. Companies have been suspended temporarily. No permanent suspensions or debarments at this point. But it is certainly could in no way be construed as an amnesty program.
Now, after the news articles and publicity broke on the Ilwin investigation, several contractors doing business with the Department of Defense were debarred. Am I correct? They were not debarred?
I think I would suggest that we let Mrs. Spector perhaps
I will ask
address that more accurately than I could. I have read some news accounts and I don't have a specific information.
I will pose that question to her. Now, let's see. This is a touchy subject here, but we have here foreign selling costs. What would give me an example of a foreign selling cost that might be allowable and one that might not be allowable?
During the years of this review, there were no foreign selling costs that were allowable because there was a cost principle which specifically said that all foreign selling costs are unallowable.
Senator Stevens or Senator Bingaman, you have. Now, let's say that the U.S. government decides that a contractor has committed fraud and they sue that contractor, take that contractor into court, or a grand jury invites. Who pays the cost of that contractor defending itself against the government?
It's a two-step process. The first requirement is that the contractor must segregate the cost of defending himself, again, in that particular complaint. The subsequent allowability of that cost depends on the outcome of the investigation and whatever procedures follow. If the contractor ultimately is found guilty or pleads no contest or in effect admits culpability, the costs are unallowable. If it's subsequently determined that the government's case was without merit, the costs are allowable.
You really didn't find in your investigation many written contracts between the defense contracting firm and the consultant or consulting firm. There weren't many written agreements between those two parties. Is this correct? Mr. Topf may want to answer that.
No, we found in a number of cases there were not, but more were very, very vague written agreements. It was a written agreement with a standard form. Again, we're talking about sensitive consultants. We're not talking about professional service costs. Where in the sensitive consultant area, it was a vague, for example, it would say Mr. X will represent the Y company in an attempt to market and sell its products in a worldwide territory. And that would be the agreement. That's the kind of...
Were you surprised, Mr. Topf or Mr. Reed, at the number of retired military personnel from the Department of Defense and/or high-ranking civilians from the department who are now working for these firms? Did that surprise you?
It didn't surprise me because there's nothing new about that. In our audits over the years, in overhead cost, there have been such individuals, and their specialized experience and knowledge is in great demand by defense contractors. So no, it did not surprise us. What did surprise us, if I may,
yes,
is that the agreements and the documentation of what these individuals were doing were in many cases very, very poor. And that bothered us, knowing the sensitivity and concern that certainly everyone should be aware of regarding the activities of these people in terms of conflicts of interest in their prior positions.
In looking and doing this report that is the subject of the hearing today, did you find that many of the consultants who were, or who had been, I should say, in the military or high-ranking civilians, low-ranking, whatever, did these, were these individuals retained to lobby or to work with the Department of Defense, to influence the Department of Defense on particular weapons or change of policy?
In specific cases, we did find agreements which specified that's exactly what they were retained to do.
Say that again, and maybe put that in your own words, not mine.
We did find situations where former government employees or military personnel were retained for the specific purpose of maintaining and providing information regarding certain specific programs, our weapon systems.
To promote those particular systems?
That certainly is the context. Now, without having the specific words, I'd hesitate to quote the exact language, but the context of the agreements, in some cases, it was very clear that that's what they were being retained to do.
Many of these cases might have been referred to the ill-win investigators.
We made 5 referrals as a result of these audits to the appropriate investigative organizations, and also provided information to, we've advised the ill-win people that we have information. They're so busy that, quite frankly, they haven't gotten to us yet to see what we've got.
I see. Senator Stevens.
No, I have no further questions.
Senator Bingham.
Chairman, could I just ask one other question? I'd like your comment on this. My understanding is the word consultant is a broad word, and consultants, as you're using the term here, as we're talking the figures up here, there are consultants who provide professional services in the sense of scientific capability and supplement a company's, a defense contractor's own personnel in being able to accomplish some kind of technological achievement. Is that right? I mean,
that certainly is right, and as I noted in my statement, we wanted to point out that our definition that we used in this audit was very broad and certainly did take into such things as legal and accounting services. For example, the annual accounting review for issuing the certifying the financial statements is included in this $200 and some million. The fact that we found widespread use of professional services as consultants should not necessarily be considered a negative thing.
The consultants that I think have generally been the subject of the discussion this morning, and that primarily are the subject of the questionable items that you've got up here, are so-called marketing consultants, aren't they? They're people who are hired by defense contractors not to perform a professional service in the sense of providing some scientific capability or doing an accounting function but instead they are employed by a defense contractor to help that defense contractor prevail in a bidding process or get a contract or stay informed on something so that he would be in a position to get a contract. Am I right or wrong? I mean, when I think of the ill wind...
That's not exactly right.
Okay,
for example, the first line item up there, lack of adequate agreement or work product, probably is primarily in the area you just described, the marketing and selling activity kind of area. The other items up there really cross the whole spectrum of professional services. For example, you could have a legal firm advising in an organization or reorganization activity within the corporation, you know, a leveraged buyout or some nonsense like that, which has no benefit at all to the government, and we would not pick up that cost. You could have accountants assisting in that. Foreign selling costs could involve professional expertise of all types.
But your audit of these particular contractors covered the gamut. You covered all consulting contracts. And some perform specific, identifiable professional services that any firm would go to an outside consultant to perform, and others did these very ill-defined kinds of things that evidently are the subject of this ill wind investigation. I mean, from what I read in the newspapers, this ill wind investigation is primarily focused on some of those kinds of marketing activities that...
That is correct. This review encompassed all of the areas that you just mentioned.
Okay. Thank you.
Chairman,
Sure.
I do have a question.
Stevens.
Now, we've gone into this question of what is the scope of the word consultant before. One of the areas I found was that we have the technical representation people. We call them tech reps. They come in, a company gets a contract, does provide the system, and then they agree to provide, as a follow-up to the system, a whole series of people who go with it and make sure it works and service it for a period of time. Those are technically within the concept of the word consultants. You didn't cover that, did you, in terms of your review? You're not covering the people who go with systems and who in effect make sure they work and they follow up airplanes and large vessels and everything. I found a couple of tech reps on a vessel out in the Persian Gulf earlier this year. So you're not into that area now, are you?
Well, what we did, first of all, we started from the cost principle, which combines professional services and consultant services all in the same cost principle. And we went to the contractor and we said, identify all the activities in your company which fall within these areas. And the contractors attempted to do that. And as Mr. Topf stated, it wasn't all in one nice little block. It was scattered throughout all of their various cost activities and cost accounts. And they themselves had a tough time identifying what to put into this category. We then attempted to verify through other sources whether that list was complete. I would say in many cases it probably did include those kinds of people. Engineering services were probably in many cases considered by these companies to be professional services and consultant services.
I see. And you mentioned legal services. Now, did you find non-legal consultants being included in the bills of law firms?
Not to my knowledge. Marie, Mr. Topf, you want to comment on that?
No. Could you repeat that question?
I'm interested in whether you found non-legal legal personnel being included in the bills of law firms. We've seen some law firms here in Washington have hired non-lawyers to run portions of their consulting business. Are they billing as consultants or billing as legal fees?
Well, we didn't to my knowledge, we didn't find any, the legal expenses that we looked at were basically legal fees.
Okay. All right.
I think we do know of situations where legal firms have hired accounting firms to support their activities in various areas. Now, we know that's happening. I don't think it came up as a particular issue in this review.
Thank you.
Mr. Reed, does it concern you or Mr. Topf that right now we have no system of cross-checking to see if these consultants hired by the contractors are also working for the Department of Defense or maybe working for a foreign government that have adversary interest to our own, or that may be a convicted felon? Does this concern you in any way?
It certainly does concern
All right.
us, and we
It
are
is-
very
it is-
anxious to see what develops in the
Right.
registration.
Inasmuch as it does, I'm wondering if you would assist me in drafting such a proposal that perhaps this subcommittee could look at early next year. I don't know whether you want to get into the policy-making business or not, but I tried a consulting registration system last year, and I was not very successful. But I hope you will assist us in looking at ways in which we can better cross-check and identify not only the people but also the services that they're performing.
Well, I know Mrs. Spector and I are quite anxious to see what OFPP is going to do under the OFP Reauthorization Act, which did require them to develop some policy area, develop policy in the area of registration and certification, and perhaps that can be the springboard for some further dialogue.
All due respect, and she's coming in just a moment, Mrs. Spector, I think she opposed my registration amendment in policy last year. But anyway, we're going to let her discuss that in a moment. I want to thank both of you this morning, and I would now. Senator
Since you
Stevens.
made that request, Mr. Chairman, I think the reason the chairman's proposal floundered was not because of the wisdom of the proposal, because of the definition of consultants. And in this process, are you doing anything about defining what the word consultant means under your regulations?
Yes, the cost principle revision that we have in process clarifies the definition that we are using in the cost principle. It expands upon the old definition considerably.
And have you coordinated that through OMB with Justice and other interested agencies? Can we get a definition of consultant this year that we'll all agree with?
I
agree.
believe Mrs. Spector probably could address that better than I can. I'm aware that the OMB is working on a definition, and I believe Mrs. Spector is getting certain information from them and coordinating.
Thank you very much. She did.
Thank you, Mr. Reed. Mr. Topf.
Thank you.
Let me ask, if I might, if our next witness will be so kind, if we're going to take a 3-minute break. Thank you. Our next witness is Ms. Eleanor R. Spector, the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Procurement, Office of the Assistant Secretary for Acquisition and Logistics and Logic. May not be any logic in your shop, but I retract that. Now, Ms. Spector, we look forward to your statement.
Good morning, Mr. Pryor, members of the subcommittee. I appreciate the opportunity to appear before you today to discuss the activities of DoD related to monitoring the use of consultants by prime contractors working on defense projects. In July of this year, the Justice Department disclosed that it had been investigating the use of consultants by defense contractors and that it found instances of alleged improper conduct by a number of parties. In response to this disclosure, Secretary Carlucci promptly took several actions. One of his first actions was to send a letter to the chief executives of the 200 largest defense firms expressing concern that some companies doing business with the department allegedly had engaged in practices which necessitated investigation. Secretary Carlucci stated his commitment to take whatever steps are necessary to assure the highest level of integrity in defense contracting and asked each CEO to join him in that commitment. Another action taken by the Secretary was to establish a special task force to formulate and implement whatever measures might be required to strengthen DoD controls over contractors' use of consultants and over related costs. One measure taken by the Special Task Force was to expedite publication of a proposed revision to the Federal Acquisition Regulations cost principle governing professional and consultant service costs, which was in process at the time. The proposed revision provided a definition of professional and consultant services, specified the kinds of services that are expressly unallowable, and described the types of supporting documentation that contractors must provide in order to claim consultant costs to be allowable. Third action taken by the Secretary in response to the Justice Department disclosure was to direct the DCAA to review a representative number of large defense firms to determine the nature and extent of consulting costs being charged to defense contracts. I will not go into the specific audit findings. Mr. Reed has quite excellently covered those. I do wish to comment briefly on the further actions the Department has taken in light of the audit findings. As a follow-up to Secretary Carlucci's July letter, we sent another letter to the 200 largest defense firms emphasizing that auditors had found contractors' internal controls over consultant costs to be inadequate, that more than half of the questioned cost was attributable to inadequate documentation, that an effective self-governance program requires effective internal controls, and that the CEOs are instrumental in establishing and maintaining those controls to assure that real value results from expenditures on consultant services. The 12 companies covered by the audit were also provided a copy of the audit report, urged to re-examine their firm's practices, and asked to ensure cooperation with the administrative contracting officer and auditors to resolve and correct the deficiencies. The remaining 188 firms were apprised of additional details regarding the audit findings, asked to review their procedures to assure that internal controls, documentation, and accounting for consultant costs were adequate and effective. We have also issued a memorandum to the services and agencies recommending that they advise contracting officers to be cognizant of the audit findings and to seek prompt correction of any deficiencies and recoupment of funds due the government. Closing, I'd like to emphasize that DCAA's review report has validated the proposed cost principle change regarding professional and consultant costs, to which I referred earlier. The report recommended minor changes to our proposed coverage. It would make the language on documentation more prescriptive by substituting the word will for may, and it would require documentation for actual services rendered on retainer. We intend to incorporate the changes prior to publication of the final rule. I also wish to emphasize that aside from using the normal review process to continue monitoring activities and costs involving the use of consultants, the Department of Defense is committed to taking whatever additional steps might become necessary in order to assure that questionable practices and excessive costs resulting from consultant use by defense contractors are eliminated. This concludes my statement.
Thank you, Ms. Spector. Senator Stevens.
No, I think, Ms. Spector, you were here when I questioned our previous witness concerning the fixed-price contracts and the costs that we thought we were prohibiting, such as the costs of overseas selling costs for a period. What is your understanding of those, the allowability of those costs if they're billed to a contractor under a fixed-fee contract?
This is the way the negotiation and billing of a fixed-price contract works, a firm fixed price. When we establish the price of that contract, if it's other than by competition, if it's by negotiation, we set the rates at that point low enough to exclude what we believe to be all unallowables. That's done on the advice of DCAA. We negotiate a rate that is sufficiently low that it excludes all predicted unallowables based on historical unallowables, if you will. As the contractor bills for progress payments on that contract, the billing rates are set low enough so that we do not include in those billing rates any unallowables that we note in the course of his performance of the contract. Now, the ultimate price of the contract, the risk of performing that contract is assumed by the contractor. We don't go back in and adjust that price for anything except defective pricing, where he's given us erroneous data at the beginning to support the negotiation, so that if he overruns in the area of engineering or manufacturing, we don't adjust the price upwards. If he underruns in any area, we don't adjust it downwards, nor do we go in and adjust the overhead rate for higher or lower incurred overheads. The billing rates that we pay for progress payments exclude all unallowables. That's on a firm fixed-price contract, so that we don't pay unallowables in the progress payments. The final price includes puts and takes in all areas. We may find additional things. He may also overrun in certain areas.
Well, then I guess our questions really have to be addressed to the IRS, because it seems to me if we say as a matter of law that certain costs are not allowable under a defense contract, and then they're attempted to be deducted against the earnings of a contract, that's where the prohibition would come into play, if I understand what you're saying. And I gather that makes sense, what you've just said. I have a great deal of problem about the increasing emphasis on these consultants. Do you have a percentage of a firm fixed contract that would be allowable for consultants?
No, sir. The way we establish the overall overhead rates, and that's where these types of charges would appear, would be on the advice of the Defense Contract Audit Agency with these large contracts right in the plant. He goes in and audits the overhead rate, provides recommendations to contracting people on what the appropriate rate should be for this year and perhaps the next 3 years if the contract is of that length. That recommended rate is based on what he knows right now on unallowables in the overhead. The rate is normally lower than what the contractor is proposing, and that would be the general and administrative rate, the engineering overhead rate, and the manufacturing overhead rate, the material overhead rate. Normally, they're somewhat lower than what the contractor is proposing.
See, I happen to believe that the smaller the size of the potential contractor, the more there may be a need for consultants of the type we're talking about. You take a consultant, take a contractor that has a small plant, say in my state, that really hears about a potential. Well, I heard about one the other day. He's one who tries to establish standards for sensitive equipment, and that person would have a difficult time understanding how to deal with this enormous Department of Defense without someone literally to advise him on how to prepare a bid or to respond to a request for proposal, as compared to a major company that's got people on their, literally in their employees, among their employees who are capable of doing this. I often wonder why so many of these large corporations need these consultants, when I know many of the people that are actually employed by the corporations have the same background. But I guess that comes down to their business judgment. But I have difficulty in understanding your regulations when I come to compare large businesses and smaller businesses that would be dealing with the Department of Defense. Now, is there a difference in your approach to the smaller or medium-sized businesses as far as this process is concerned?
The fact is, on negotiated contracts, we review the costs going in approximately the same way with large and small contractors. Now, that's not to say we would disallow the cost of proposal advice to either a large or a small contractor. If we see what the individual is doing, if it's appropriate, if it's reasonable, our current provisions provide that it would be allowable. Consultant costs, by definition, are not unallowable. Whether it's a large or a small, if they can't show a causal or beneficial relationship to a government contract, DCAA would normally question the cost. It's not to say that when we get into negotiations with the contractor, he may not have further explanation, further documentation to support his position. But approximately the same kinds of rules are applied when we look at large and small contractors, where we look to see the reasonableness of the cost and that there is documentation supporting what the individual or firm was doing for the contractor.
Thank you. Well, I appreciate your statement concerning Secretary Carlucci. I think he has set an example for his successor in terms of his prompt recognition of the interest of those of us in the Congress in this subject and the manner in which he moved so aggressively to attempt to change the departmental procedures, particularly in light of some of the examples we've had in the last year with regard to activities of consultants. I think Secretary Carlucci has attempted to change the process that led to some of those glaring examples this past year. And we're grateful to him, at least I am, for what he did while he has been there. So I thank you for helping him.
Ms. Spector, could you give us any off-the-record inside information this morning on who might be Mr. Carlucci's successor? Surely.
I wondered if you might have some.
Surely you know.
I myself have not been asked.
We know that.
Senator Stevens says it won't be either of us. Senator Bingaman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Spector, I might have missed this in the earlier testimony, but I was here for most of it. What is the plan with regard to this $57 million of questionable costs now? Do those get unallowed? What happens?
Of the $57 million, 43 have been charged to defense contracts. Of that amount, $19 million has been charged to flexibly priced contracts.
Right.
It's that $19 million that we have directed contracting officers to get back from contractors in the negotiation of overhead rates.
Okay, so that will be recovered, that $19 million?
Yes, sir. It's not completely clear that we've paid the remainder. Bear in mind, it was on fixed-price contracts. If we had negotiated the overhead rate sufficiently low, as I hope we did in most of those cases, unallowables would have been excluded from those contracts by definition. So that it's not clear that we paid the remainder. Those were the amounts charged to the contracts. Bear in mind, there are amounts charged that could result in an overrun, for instance, to a contract that technically we would not pay.
Oh, I see. So that some of this $57 million, or some of the $43 million may not have been charged to the government. You're saying it may have been charged to a contract.
To a contract, conceivably, if the contract was overrunning, for instance, already.
Okay.
Or in a situation where the overhead rate at the initial negotiation was established sufficiently low to exclude all unallowables, which is what we tried to do. It's again possible that there was no amount included in that original contract in the price for this. Now, of course, we also would not be paying it as part of billing rates. So effectively in that situation, it would come out of his profit.
So we should expect that as a result of this audit report, the government will be reimbursed or will be in a position to refuse payment of $19 million that would otherwise have been charged.
Very possibly. It might not have been charged. Again, if the rates were set low enough, we would certainly exclude it from our final negotiation of overhead rates for those years, for 86 and 87 with the contractors involved. Yes, sir.
Now, with regard, that was for 12 contractors that
Yes.
they went out and checked on. The other 188, I gathered in your statement here, you talk about the letter that Secretary Carlucci sent to the 200 largest defense contractors. The other 188 got a follow-up letter.
Yes, all 200 did.
All 200 did.
The 12 got a special letter. The other 188 got also a letter.
Okay, what action is planned with regard to this 188 to try to catch the same problems that were caught with regard to these 12?
As Mr. Reed mentioned, we're now auditing an additional 18 very large contractors for just this kind of area. Some of the 200, it's not a major critical issue. For instance, there are fuel companies involved in those 200 where their work is all competitive. We don't scrutinize costs in competitive contracts where they win as low bidder or for other reasons. The contractors in all 188, I would assume that Bill will give direction to DCAA at all of our contractors to further scrutinize these kinds of costs and do it fairly carefully as part of the ongoing DCAA review of the people who review proposals and review overhead rates.
Okay, so you would be fairly confident that these kinds of costs, when charged by any of the 200, would be caught in the course of your normal DCA auditing process? Is
I would
that
hope
the
so.
expectation?
Yes, I would hope that they would. We've also sent out guidance to our contracting officers to be aware of what was in the audit and to look into getting the money back and correcting the internal control problems that existed at these and probably can be assumed to exist at other contractors as well.
Okay. The point that Mr. Reed made about the new 1987 regulation providing for the charging of penalties and interest on unallowable costs. Now, that's by regulation?
That's by law.
So there's a statute that
Yes, sir.
specifies that. In your view, is that going to dissuade this kind of charging to a significant extent in the future? Is that going to be an effective deterrent?
I would think that a lot of what we've done has already been an effective deterrent. Bear in mind, ill wind occurred in the middle of 1988. The costs that were audited of necessity are 86 and 87. Talking to industry associations, the feel I'm getting is they're doing a much more thorough job now of reviewing these kinds of costs, of questioning them. We heard of one contractor who fired all the consultants working for the contractor, and it was a fairly large contractor. I would say that between that law, between the overhead cost certification, and as Mr. Reed mentioned, the cases that we've had and ill wind, I would say it has had a rather chastening effect on all of our contractors. They don't like their names appearing in the paper for doing the wrong thing. And the CEOs are the ones who are hurt by that, and the CEOs are the ones that I understand are starting to take very strict action in these areas.
Is this overhead cost certification, does it have any real teeth in it? I mean, it seems to me it's virtually impossible to make a case against somebody who signs such a certificate.
When you say that, it has to be signed at a very high level in the company, at no lower than one step below the presidential level. People at that level are very reluctant to put their name on a certificate certifying something if they haven't done a thorough review. The information that I saw showed that question cost at companies that were certifying had dropped 50% in the unallowables area. Now, I don't know, that wasn't data that covered all contractors, all certificates, and it was about a year or two ago that I saw the data. But it has had an effect on reducing the amount of questioned unallowable costs. As Mr. Reed suggested, some of these costs contractors will argue are not what we say they are. This is DCAA's view of what they are, and we certainly try to sustain those at negotiations. But occasionally additional evidence is provided indicating that they're more supportable than we initially thought.
Now, does the overhead certification apply to all? I mean, is that something that is a part of all your contracts now?
All contracts where we have negotiated overhead rates, all the large contractors where there are negotiated overhead rates, indeed, yes, it does apply.
Okay. In your view, is there anything more that should be done by way of changes in the law or changes in the regulations other than what you've already testified has been done to build in a disincentive to contractors charging unallowable costs as DCAA has testified they did in this case, these cases?
I think our regulations are fairly strong in this area now on what is unallowable, and I think there's a pretty good understanding, as you've heard from contractors who resent all the auditing that's going on, that we're auditing quite thoroughly these kinds of costs. The likelihood that we'll find them is reasonably good. At this point, beyond tightening up the definition and the documentation required in the cost principle, I don't think we need additional regulations in this area on unallowables and on auditing more extensively. It remains an implementation problem. I do think there needs to be a more thorough review of why consultants are being used by CEOs and by people in positions of responsibility. I think that's starting to occur. But that is critical. It's an implementation problem more than anything. Making more things unallowable or having more auditing or more rules at this point doesn't appear to me to be the answer.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Inspector, were you surprised? You heard Mr. Reed testify this morning and Mr. Topf. Were you surprised at any of the findings in the DCAA audit?
I don't know that I was surprised. It was approximately what I might have expected and predicted. I suspected that documentation would be a problem. I can't say I would have predicted precise amounts, but when you audit approximately $50 billion worth of costs, that about $200 million is charged for this kind of service is probably not a great shock to me.
If you were surprised, or maybe even not surprised, why was it that you waited until you were mandated by Mr. Carlucci to look at these consulting costs? Why did you wait so late?
I guess the surprise was not at the audit. I was surprised at the ill wind revelations, and it was the ill wind revelations that encouraged us to look at these kinds of areas. I'm on the working group, of course, that is supporting Mr. Carlucci in the areas that we should be focusing on.
This is although a post-ill wind operation.
Yes, sir.
And this
Yes, sir.
Congress and this committee has been telling the Department of Defense for 10 years about these consulting costs that are being passed on to the taxpayer. Now, why hasn't someone done something about this before we have to have a grand jury investigation of all these contractors and all these consultants? Why are we waiting so long? What's the matter?
Sir, we really didn't. There's FAR coverage in the FAR already and has been on consultants who work directly for the government, requiring contracting officers to investigate conflicts of interest and put clauses in contracts and in solicitations delineating conflicts of interest, and that they are prohibited on our contracts, and that we won't do business with someone on particular service contracts where there are conflicts of interest.
Now,
There was also a FAR cost principle.
There is no way to cross-check a consultant hired by a defense contractor to see if that same consultant at that moment is working for the Department of Defense. Now, if there is, you tell me about it.
You're correct, sir. However, before we award a contract to a services contractor or a particular consultant, the contracting officer checks to be sure there's no conflict of interest with the work he's performing for us. That is a requirement of the FAR, and he has to have a clause in his contract to that effect. That has been a requirement of the FAR.
So it's kind of I call it self-policing, you call it self-monitoring.
It's more than self. We make it a mandatory contractual provision in any contract where we buy services that the contractor, in some cases we specify which companies he may not do business with or what programs he may not do business on. And that's done before we award any contract for services that we award. Now,
Ms. Spector,
yes, sir.
What about some of the companies that are being looked at in the investigation of ill wind? And we will not talk about those specific names. I noticed in our last witness agenda, when I mentioned that I asked Mr. Reed if any of these had been debarred. I think in the audience you were shaking your head. Now, I don't know whether you were agreeing or disagreeing. Have any been debarred?
No, sir.
Any have been suspended?
No, sir. Not due to ill wind. No, they have not.
What's the normal suspension of a contractor? What is the length of time?
Normally, it would occur when they are indicted for a contract-related action. That is normally when we would suspend them. We do for other reasons as well. In the case of ill wind, we don't have in our hands any hard evidence as to what these contractors have done. What we have is newspaper articles and rumors. We've done two things to protect our interests when dealing with those contractors, but neither has been debarment or suspension.
Are you familiar with the so-called not contracting industry? Mr. Reed looked at the 12 largest defense contractors. Are you familiar with the consulting industry or that phase of our investigation today? Are you aware of this association of consultants who do work for the government?
There are several associations.
Right. Do you know of any of these associations who have, and could you give me an example of any degree or plan of self-policing that they have adopted for themselves?
I'm not familiar.
Or self-governing?
I'm not familiar, sir, with what they've done in that regard.
Do you feel that the penalties and the punishments are severe enough on these contractors who are trying to pass through these costs and charge them to the taxpayer?
I believe currently the penalties probably are severe enough. I don't necessarily think it's lack of penalties that's causing this.
Inspector, why do you think Mr. Reed and Mr. Topf testified that in fact in their written report and the executive summary stated they got very little cooperation from the defense industry being audited?
I guess I couldn't guess the reasons other than there is some reluctance to cooperate at times with auditors when they're coming in to do something that you don't like.
In the additional firms, the 18 additional firms that will now be audited, how long will that audit take? I probably should have asked Mr. Reed that.
Perhaps he can answer. I truly don't know, sir. At the
End of February, if the record was so state. Mr. Reed volunteered that from the audience. Do you have any recommendations to this committee as to how we might tighten these potential conflicts of interest that we have?
I would say that in the area of consultants working for prime contractors.
And also working for the Department of Defense at the same time.
Yes, there are two areas. For those working...
And our foreign agents at the same time, and our possible felons working for both at the same time, or at one.
When OFPP was asked to put out the policy, at that time we were working on revising our own policy to toughen it up a bit, if you will. We currently have a policy on this at Part 9.5 of the FAR, an organizational conflict of interest. I believe we need to work on the definition in that, and I believe we need to put out a draft clause, perhaps, that would protect against organizational conflict of interest. The gist of a policy is certainly here, and it tells contracting officers to review this in any case they suspect there might be this sort of conflict of interest. I believe we have to tighten up our own rules on this. Again, we're waiting for the OFPP policy issuance on that. Now, as far as the cost principle, which applies to costs that for consultants that contractors use, I think, again, the definition needs to be tightened up, and we are indeed doing that. And I think the mandatory requirements of certain documentation need to be imposed, and we are doing that as well.
How can we have a cross-reference or a cross-checking system to know who's working for who or who's working for two or three sides of the street if we don't have some kind of registration? How do we do this?
Sir, it's my belief that when we enter a contract with someone, we have to do everything that we need to do to assure ourselves he has no conflict of interest and is not a convicted felon or a person we don't want to deal with. Indeed, we must be very, very careful to do that. With the contractors, we need to carefully and strenuously review whether the costs that he is incurring have a beneficial relationship to our government contracts. Now, I believe those two things can be separate. I'm not sure we need to impose upon DCAA the requirement to cross-reference. I think the contracting officer who hires an advisory or assistance service for the government needs to assure himself that that individual or firm has no conflict of interest.
Now, I proposed registration legislation. As I said, I was not successful. Did you, what were your feelings about this?
We would support a registration that would be useful to the contracting officer in making his determinations. We did not necessarily oppose registration.
Well, if I may interrupt,
Yes, sir.
Respectfully,
Sure.
my distinguished colleague and member of the Armed Services Committee, Senator John Warner of Virginia, on August the 11th, during the debate on this registration amendment, placed into the record a long summary of the Department of Defense's position on my amendment, Section 12, and I'll take just a sentence or two in the middle of that contract, quote, simply put, DOD has no need, desire, or end use for registration. The penalty of suspension or debarment for failure to comply is totally contrary to its intended use. Now, that doesn't sound like that y'all were very hopeful about wanting to get some system of registration.
The letter that I have is from Kathleen Buck, who's our general counsel, and what she says is that the Department of Defense does not necessarily object to the concept of registration of consultants. We could support a registration that was not unduly burdensome, that would elicit information necessary to enable us to identify potential conflicts of interest resulting from the work that a consultant undertakes for the department and the work the consultant performs for others. The letter that I recall did not categorically oppose registration. The registration needs to be available to and submitted to the contracting officer. We have those people all over the world. A central bank may not have information on a real-time basis for him. He needs to do it every time he awards a contract. That's all I would ask. I don't mind his forwarding that information to a central bank, but it needs to be made available to him when he makes his decision whether or not to award. That's all I would ask.
Of this $43 million that DCAA has found questionable, how much of that are we collecting?
I would at least $19 million. It's not clear that we've necessarily paid the remainder. It was charged to government contracts, but if the delta between 43 and 19 was charged, let's say, to a fixed price contract that is overrunning, the contractor would not get any additional money on that contract, though of course he's required to charge to it. If the overhead rate initially was established low enough to exclude these kinds of unallowables, which I would hope it was, we would not be paying these kinds of costs on that contract.
But up until March of 1987, and you may correct me if I'm wrong, there was no real penalty for passing these costs onward. Is this correct?
That is basically correct, yes,
We didn't
sir.
even collect interest on what they owed us.
No, we didn't.
Do you believe that the contractor has the burden of proof of proving their own reasons for passing costs on to the taxpayer?
Absolutely. That's another change we made to the cost principles requiring that the burden of proof for unallowables be on the contractor.
The DCAA testified in their report to us that they reported that for several years they've discovered problems with so-called consulting services. And we've talked about one of them today, and it's the enigma of all of us, and that's the definition. Is this the first time that the Department of Defense is really looking at consulting costs for the... Is this the first time since Illwind?
No, sir. We had two provisions in the FAR, one governing the consultants that we hire, and one a cost principle on the consultants that contractors hire. Those provisions have existed for many, many years in the FAR, regulating both areas. What we focused on is whether they need to be tightened up in light of the ill wind findings, and that's what we've been focusing on, and whether our enforcement has been stringent enough, though we have been enforcing both of those provisions.
I see. Now, Mr. Reed testified also that many of the consulting officers being employed by the defense contractors were former military personnel and civilians from the Department of Defense. What steps are you taking to make certain that these consultants are in compliance with the revolving door statutes now in the books?
Sir, I'm going to have to answer that for the record. It's not in my immediate area of oversight. It is in our Office of General Counsel rather than in procurement oversight. My office doesn't oversee revolving door kinds.
If we could possibly get that statement answered for the record,
Yes, sir, we certainly shall.
I would deeply appreciate that. For the record, at the appropriate time, Senator Sasser of Tennessee has a statement to be inserted at the appropriate place in the record. Ms. Spector, are you familiar with a small office that was created recently called the Office of Operational Testing? It's a Jack Kring's office, and it's basically there to sort of get an independent guidance system for testing of weapons so the manufacturers and contractors won't be testing their own. Are you somewhat familiar with it? It's relatively new.
Certainly aware that it was created.
Now, would it concern you if some of the people who are employed by the independent Office of Operational Testing, some of the consultants hired by this office, were also employed by the contracting industry who manufactured the weapons? Would that be a conflict of interest?
It could. It wouldn't by definition be, sir. For instance, the world's foremost expert on stealth conceivably might be advising both sources where it might not be. On the other hand, it could be. I couldn't unequivocally say by definition it would be. It might be.
One concern, and I assume this is not your area, and that is the Defense Science Board. I think potentially there's some ultimate conflicts there and major conflicts. Do you have any way to know if consultants who are being hired by the Department of Defense or by the contractors getting all of the contracts, or are they hiring members of the Defense Science Board as consultants?
Sir, I don't know. I would have to take, again,
and if so,
that for the
if
record.
they are in fact, would this be a conflict of interest?
Again, I hesitate to say that by definition it would be, but it would be something that probably ought to be looked at.
How can the Department of Defense encourage these contractors, the defense contractors, to strengthen their own internal system of monitoring consultant activity? How can they do this?
Well, we've done it head-on by having Mr. Carlucci write directly to the CEOs and tell them they had better pay more attention in this area, because we certainly are. And by asking our auditors to go in and focus on these sorts of areas forces the contractors to focus on those areas as well, probably more effectively than writing more policy does. We've always had the right to do it. The fact is we now are doing it, and by asking our auditors and our contracting officers to focus heavily in this area, I would say we're forcing our contractors to do so as well.
Do you have any final comments you'd like to make?
No, sir.
Well, once again, Ms. Spector, in behalf of the committee, I thank you for coming. And I'm going to conclude the meeting, but I will say this. I do think that we've got a pretty serious problem. I think we have a lot of potential for conflict. I think ill wind is probably going to show us more in detail how these relationships are formed. I think we have an old buddy boy network out there that is alive and well and has been in a feeding frenzy for a number of years. And I'm not talking about Republican administration or Democrat. It's been going on a very, very long time. And until we have the contractors and the consultants and all of this underground that we're dealing with and pouring these billions and billions of dollars into, till we shine some light, some sunshine into this world that very few of us know about and cannot even define, can't account for, I think that we're jeopardizing our national security. And I know we're jeopardizing the taxpayer. I hope that you will cooperate with this committee, and thank you very, very much. The meeting is adjourned.